Ed Kemper is one of those names that rings a bell with many of us, including those outside the borders of the United States. He's one of the most well-known serial killers of all time, who raped corpses, mutilated dead bodies, and buried his victims' heads in his backyard. A story like that tends to spread pretty quickly. In this episode, we'll take a look at Ed Kemper's early life and what drove him to take his first victims.
Discretion is advised. This is 10-Minute Murder.
Welcome to 10-Minute Murder, brief and bingeable true crime. My name is Joe, I'm the host, and I really appreciate you joining today. If you're new to listening to this podcast, I hope that you'll subscribe and check out more of the episodes available. Also, down in the show notes, you'll find a link to help you connect with 10-Minute Murder on social media. And the question has been posed if my personality on this podcast is the same as it is away from the podcast. And fortunately, or unfortunately, yeah, there's really no reason for me to act differently here than I do in normal life. I saw one of the people that listens to this podcast post a meme on their story on Instagram, and I thought it described my normal, everyday walking around attitude pretty well. If we're ever in a no-laughing situation, absolutely don't even look in my direction. For some reason, when you're not supposed to laugh, that's when I want to laugh the most. And I don't know what's wrong with me, but I'm pretty sure there are other people like that, so it doesn't make me feel as bad. But I make jokes about everything. Not always funny jokes, but I find humor in nearly every situation. And I'm one of those weirdos that believes that happiness is a decision that you make every day. You can decide to be miserable and negative, or you can decide to be happy and positive. I mean, within reason. I get into bad moods too, and sometimes I pretend to be positive. That's when I'm around other people. If I'm not around other people, I will pretend to be positive a little bit. But when I'm around other people, I just don't want to give off that negative energy if I'm feeling it. Holy crap. I think I've just turned my murder show into a Tony Robbins TED Talk. My bad. Subscribe and all the things. Let's get to today's story. Edmund Kemper III was born in Burbank, California on December 18, 1948. His father, a World War II veteran, was obviously named Edmund Kemper II, but he went by E.E. to make things a bit easier. Ed's mother was called Claire Nell, and he also had an older and a younger sister. There's always something going on at the Kemper household, and not necessarily in a good way. Claire Nell was a woman with a massive attitude and alcohol problem, and she ruled her family with an iron fist. For her, it was not enough that E.E. provided a comfortable life for his family. She still complained about his job and passive personality, so much so that E.E. once said, quote, "Suicide missions in wartime and the later atomic bomb testings were nothing compared to living with Claire Nell." Jesus. Little Ed, of course, craved his parents' attention like most kids do, but he never received much. His mother didn't want to see her son become submissive as his father, or quote, turn gay, so she was extremely strict with Ed and rarely showed any kind of affection. Imagine thinking that affection can turn you gay. If Claire Nell saw E.E. giving affection to their son, there were consequences. So Ed grew up feeling isolated, unloved, and had no self-esteem. Ed's problems at home followed him to school, where he saw his teachers as extensions of his mother. He was fearful and shy in front of adults, only expecting to be punished for something like his mother always did for the smallest reasons. Ed's odd behavior didn't go unnoticed by his peers. He was bullied all the time. Sometimes it was for his poor grades, sometimes for his shy personality, or his size. We all know kids can be cruel, and Ed had a tough time making friends. Because of that, he spent most of his time alone. To make things even worse, E.E. abandoned his family in 1957, leaving his children with their tyrannical mother. After that, Ed's behavior began to develop in a category that you would describe as worrisome. With his sisters, Ed would play games like electric chair and gas chamber, pretending he had just been sentenced to death and then acting out what would happen. At first, Ed's sisters didn't have much of a problem playing these weird games with their brother, but as soon as Ed began to rip off the heads of their dolls, they pretty much said, "We're out." Ed did later give an explanation for why he had been destroying his sister's toys. He said, "I remember there was actually a sexual thrill. You hear that little pop and pull their heads off, and hold them by the hair, whipping their heads off, their body just sitting there. Ed's obsession with death only grew more intense day by day. Finally, when he was 10 years old, it reached the point where he just took the family cat one day and buried it alive in their backyard. But of course, that wasn't enough for Ed. After he was sure the animal was dead, he dug it back up, decapitated it, and examined the body. Several years later, another cat experienced a similar fate, but this time Ed used a knife and also fully dismembered the animal so he could keep pieces of the body inside this closet. Ed wanted to remember the rush he had felt when committing the deed. At 10 years old, so many red flags. And then there was an incident when 12-year-old Ed confessed to his sister that he had a crush on one of his teachers. And it wasn't the revelation itself that was unsettling, but his reply to his sister when she teased him and said that he should just kiss her and see what happens. He said, "If I kiss her, I'd have to kill her first." And I know you're wondering, what's the mother doing about all of this? Well, she wasn't fully aware of Ed's questionable behavior. She had found rotting pieces of the family pet inside Ed's closet after noticing a disgusting smell. But instead of sitting down with her son and trying to find better things for him to do, Clarnell just began to treat Ed worse. She often locked him in the basement for the night, forcing him to sleep down there on the floor that was cold and wet. She claimed that she was afraid Ed would hurt her or his sisters, which might have been a valid reason, but the solution was obviously wrong. In addition, Ed's mother kept verbally abusing him and constantly saying that her son would never be loved by a woman. There's a limit for everyone and everything, and in Ed's case, his breaking point was reached for the first time when he was 15 years old. One day, Ed packed his things and just ran away from his mother's house. He hitchhiked to his father's new home just outside of Los Angeles, hoping for a fresh start. But as soon as Ed arrived, he realized E.E. now had a new family, including a stepson. Nevertheless, his father did welcome Ed to live with them, but he just felt replaced and started acting hostile and aggressive. After 1 month, E.E. asked his son to leave. His mother also didn't want him under her roof, not that Ed would have wanted that anyway, so he was sent to live with his paternal grandparents. Clarnell thought her decision was best for everybody. She tried to protect her family from Ed and his disturbing behavior and prevent something irreversible from happening. But there was one thing Clarnell did not seem to think about: who was protecting Ed's grandparents. In 1963, Ed moved in with Maud and Edmund Kemper I, who lived on a secluded 17-acre farm in Northern California by the mountains. Ed wasn't feeling too happy because he was isolated from his family and rejected by both his father and his mother, but he did get along pretty well with his grandparents, especially with his grandfather. Ed made an effort to spend time with Edmund Sr., and the two often went hunting together. But pretty soon, Ed started to feel like Maud was just an extension of his mother. Ed's grandmother didn't really drink or use physical punishment, but she still had a difficult temper and was quick to scold. And sometimes she was hard on him, hoping to push him in a more positive, productive direction. Maud was also hard on her husband, Edmund Sr., and he had begun to suffer from dementia and needed more help and care from his wife, which Maud considered pathetic. According to Ed, his grandmother would frequently say that she had more balls than any man and was constantly emasculating Ed and her husband to prove it. Ed hated this kind of behavior, which reminded him too much of his mother. Because of that, Ed and Maud argued all the time until they reached the second breaking point. Ed said, "I couldn't please her. It was like being in jail. I became a walking time bomb, and I finally blew." The last time Ed felt this same way, he just ran away, but that wasn't an option now. And so on August 27th, 1964, after yet another explosive argument with Maud, Ed picked up his grandfather's .22 caliber rifle and shot his grandmother in the back of her head. Maud never saw it coming. But the rage inside Ed didn't go away. It wasn't enough that his grandmother was dead. He had to do more. So Ed took a large knife and began stabbing Maud's body again and again and again. When he was finally finished, Ed dragged his grandmother into the bedroom. Slowly, panic started to settle in. Ed didn't want his grandfather to find out what he had done to his wife. So Ed came up with the only possible solution, in his mind at least. When his grandfather later returned to the house and walked up the driveway, Ed shot him too, once in the head. After that, Ed didn't know what to do. He was just a 15-year-old teenager who had just killed 2 people. And while he'd always thought he wanted to know what it felt like to take a life, he had never considered what came afterward. Feeling lost and confused, Ed did what many kids do when they are in a difficult situation. He called his mother. Clarnell Kemper didn't believe what she was hearing. Her own son calmly explaining that he had just murdered both of his grandparents, and Ed was asking her what to do next. After recovering from the initial shock, Clarnell told her son to call the police and tell them what happened. So Ed did that. Authorities arrived at the Kemper farm within an hour and took the surprisingly calm teenager into custody. Ed really did his best to make the police officer's job as easy as he could. He cooperated, he never argued with the authorities, and was always honest and obedient. After a court-ordered psychiatric evaluation, it was determined that Ed had paranoid schizophrenia, as well as a very impressive IQ of 145. Because of this diagnosis, Ed Kemper was sent to the criminally insane unit of the Atascadero State Hospital. There, he felt more at home than he had ever felt in his life. Finally, his life had some kind of structure, which helped him control his thoughts and actions. And while Ed had struggled immensely in regular school, in state hospital, he excelled at learning. It was clear that despite what he had done, he was actually a very intelligent person. So much so that as his condition kept improving, Ed's doctors began to question if he was really paranoid schizophrenic. Ed didn't have the hallucinations and delusion, which are two main symptoms of the illness, and he did too well in all of his tests. And so Ed was eventually re-diagnosed with passive-aggressive type personality trait disturbance, which also meant that his doctors believed that Ed could be rehabilitated and possibly released back into society. But little did they know that Ed Kemper had not changed as much as they thought. Instead, he had purposely hid his true feelings and urges. Ed, as I mentioned before, was extremely smart, and he listened to his doctors and learned how to develop an alternate reality inside his brain. There, Ed kept all of his darkest fantasies hidden from those around him, hoping that it would be enough to get him out of the hospital one day. And it was. In the end, Edmund Kemper only spent 5 years incarcerated for the double murder of his grandparents. In 1969, on his 21st birthday, Ed was released. His doctors thinking the brilliant young man had great things ahead of him. In reality, Ed's murderous urges had not disappeared. They were very much alive, and soon enough, he would not be able to resist them anymore. But we'll discuss that in the next episode. That's 10-Minute Murder for today. Brief and bingeable true crime. Thanks for listening to part 1 of the Ed Kemper story. Make sure you're subscribed before you go. That way you don't miss part 2. In the show notes of this episode, you'll find links where you can connect with 10-Minute Murder on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter. Or just as easily, you can go to any of those and type 10-Minute Murder into the search bar, and it'll pop right up. Finally, if you have friends that are into brief true crime stories like this, make sure you let them know about 10-Minute Murder. Thanks for listening. Be safe, and have a good night.